recording now. I'm also going to make available a live transcript. So you can, sorry, I'm just clicking that. So you can go to the bottom of your screen and click on, are you seeing it, Samantha? It's, if you click on the three arrows, I think, on more, does that look the same on your screen? If you click on the three arrows, you can, you should be able to click on live transcript, and that will give you, not perfect, but it will give you the best. Yes, thank you for someone sharing that. You see it as live transcript. So you can click on that to enable access. Feel free to continue to use the chat and type your questions in there, and we'll be monitoring that as we go along. We have some questions we'll pose to you, so that will be our way of communicating together. And I know some of you did post questions during the registration process, and we're going to do our best to cover most of those as well. But if you feel like we've missed something, please use the chat to help us with that. So, so welcome again. I am Jodi Dworkin. I am a professor and work with University of Minnesota Extension at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Family Social Science. I've been studying families and technology use for a really long time now, and we're excited to share some of what we've been learning from research and what we've been learning and hearing from young people and parents about what's been working with technology use, how technology use and social media has changed with COVID. And I'll be co-presenting with my colleague, Samantha. Do you want to introduce yourself, Samantha?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, my name is Samantha LeBouef. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Department of Family Social Science at the University of Minnesota. And my research has focused on college students and their technology communication with family members, specifically with social media. So I'm excited to share what we have with you today.
Great. So thanks, Samantha. So we're going to start with a quick poll here. And we know many of you have already shared this in the chat, but this will be a quick way for us all to see who is here with us. So let me launch this poll. So you should be able to answer this question. So are you a caregiver? I'm not a caregiver, but work with caregivers, or both. I'm a caregiver and I also work with caregivers. So we'll give you a few seconds to. Great, so we have a combination. We have some who are caregivers, some who are not caregivers, but work with caregivers, and many of you are juggling both of those roles in addition to all the many other roles that you are juggling. So we'll do our best to hopefully cover information that is useful for all of that. So, okay, so hopefully you can see those results now as well. Okay, so we're going to cover kind of three main objectives today. First, we're going to talk about some of the benefits and challenges of teen technology and social media use. So we like to talk about both perspectives, that there are benefits and there are challenges and risks. And so we're going to talk some about both of that. We're also going to share some of what we're learning about how screen time changed during the pandemic and has changed over the past 18 months. And we'll say more about that. And then we'll talk a little bit more about how to think about screen time and technology use among your teens, the teens that you're working with, and what that could look like in terms of setting rules and limits, and how that might look in families. Okay. So before we jump too much into it, I want to just share a few a few things to acknowledge this sort of unique time that we're in, right? So specifically as it relates to COVID. So we're going to start with some data that are pre-COVID statistics. So they don't necessarily reflect, if we were to ask young people and families these questions right now. And over the past 18 months, when schools closed, when out of school time programs closed, sports shut down, there was a huge spike in technology use among young people and a real sense among families that technology was the only way to connect with others. And caregivers were forced to make a lot of hard decisions and decisions they hadn't necessarily thought about. So should I let my teen get a cell phone when I wasn't planning on doing it quite yet? Should I let them join Instagram when I had already told them no? Or if I'm trying to work from home, like how do I monitor their tech use when they're on it all the time? So there's a lot of complex questions that came up that none of us were really prepared for. So as young people are now, many young people are returning to school, a lot of youth activities and programs have reopened. We're starting to see another transition time, another shift where young people are generally on screens less because they're just doing more out of the house. They have more opportunities to do things that are not online. And in fact, we're even starting to hear young people looking for non-tech alternatives. So we're going to start from this assumption that kids, yes, they want to be online, but they don't want to be online all the time. They are looking for other things to do and other ways to have their social goals met. So let's go to the next. So here's a couple sort of general assumptions that I think you'll hear throughout what we're talking about. The first is that adolescents and young people, they're active users of technology, right? I mean, that's sort of a given, and they've generally grown up with it. And most of us, many of us who are on this call probably didn't grow up with it, right? I did not grow up with technology in the same way that my 5th and 9th grader are now growing up with technology. With social media, when we think about new tools emerging, teens are often the first in the family. They're the first ones introducing things to the family. They come home talking about it. They come home wanting to join it in ways that maybe caregivers weren't, they didn't know about it. They hadn't heard about it. They didn't know, exactly how does TikTok work? Like, what does it do? Why would you want to be on it? And so young people are the introducers of a lot of that. And technology and social media can be both beneficial and also potentially harmful, and has changed quite a lot, again, over the past 18 months. So what's really important, and what we're going to talk a lot about today, is the prevalence of technology in all of our lives. So not just for teens, but for all of us. And thinking about how we use technology and how we feel about technology will be really important to understanding and thinking about teen technology use. So we want to share just some general statistics just to give you kind of an overall profile of what teen technology use looks like. Some of this may surprise you, some of this may not be surprising. But if you look at this data here, by age 11, the majority, so over half of kids have their own smartphone, and you see a pretty big jump when you go to by age 12, where about 2/3 do. So smartphone ownership has risen dramatically, and even among our youngest kids, so among 8-year-olds, 1 in 5 have their own smartphone, right? That's a pretty big number. So when young people, 13 to 15-year-olds start saying, I'm the only one who doesn't have a cell phone, or I'm the only one who doesn't have a smartphone, statistically, they're not totally right, but it very much may feel like they're right when 80 or more than 80% of the young people around them are actively using smartphones. So I'm going to pause here for just a second and ask you to take a second to think about how do you think teens are spending their time online? So think about that for a second. What comes to mind, and what do you think teens are doing when they're online? Okay, let's reveal some of what we know now. So a lot of time that teens are spending online, so the tweens, so TikTok we see in the chat, yes. For tweens, so 8 to 12-year-olds, about half of them, most of their time is spent watching videos online. a lot of time spent on YouTube, a lot of time spent gaming. So you can see 53% of tweens' time is spent watching videos and gaming. A smaller amount, about 16% of their time, is on social media. So it's not necessarily on social media, but of what we traditionally think of as social media, I should say. But things like gaming certainly are ways that they're interacting and are social activities in and of themselves as well. Okay, so let's see what else they're doing. So the percent of young people who say they're watching videos online every day has more than doubled when we look at both tweens and teens. So it's gone from about 24% to 56% among 8 to 12-year-olds and 34% to 69% among 13 to 18-year-olds. So that's a pretty big number. And the amount of time they're spending watching videos has gone from about a half an hour a day to about an hour a day. Okay, so that's a double. That's twice as much. When you look at what platforms they say they're using, Snapchat and YouTube are standing out as the most frequent. That's what they say they use most often, and the largest number of teens say they're using that. There's not as much data on TikTok because it's newer. But when we look at fall of 2020, it was estimated that about 69% of teens were using TikTok at least monthly. So we have this image of, how we think young people what young people are doing online and how they're spending their time online. And so this next figure shows us how they actually want to communicate with their friends. So we have this image that they're online all the time. And when we ask them, like, how do you really want to talk to your friends? How do you really want to connect? They say texting and in person. Those are the main things that come out. Now you can see the decline from in person, right? That has gone down, but it's about just as high as texting. And texting is really different than in person, right? It's quick, it's easy to do a check-in. You can send a quick picture when you're not with somebody. I think it's easy to, send them a picture of what you're doing or where you are, or make plans and coordinate things. And so it's not surprising. And what we generally see is that then these ways of communication are complementary. So this, I think, is really important because it reinforces that young people don't just want to communicate using technology. They still want those in-person connections, and technology can be a really important way to complement that when they're not together, when they're not with friends, or similarly when they're also not with family. So how do teens feel when they're online, and what do they say they do? So this shows some of the ways that teens report feeling when they're using social media. And you see generally, there's a lot of sort of positive responses. So teens report feeling less lonely, less depressed, less anxious, more confident, better about themselves, more popular. Now, caregivers may not agree with this. I mean, I think if you ask caregivers, they may not agree that teens experience these benefits that teens are reporting. But teens are also reporting that they're using it to keep up with friends, that they use it to have meaningful conversations and to express themselves. So there are some benefits. And if you've been following any of the kind of media or discussion about kind of Instagram and Facebook, and they report that social media can have really harmful effects on kids. And so it's a both and. There's not a sort of it's good for kids or it's bad for kids. It depends a lot on the context. It depends a lot on young people and how they're using it, and the context in which they're using it, and who they're using it with, and what they're using it for. So when we ask parents, what do they say about teens' screen time? About 65% say they worry about their teens spending too much time in front of screens. Probably not surprising. And if you look at that bottom number, then about 86% say they are somewhat confident or very confident about how much screen time is appropriate. But then when they're asked, like, do you limit or do you monitor what's going on? Only about half say they do, right? So there's this sort of place where we see some different reports where like parents say they're worried, but they say they kind of know what should be happening, but they're not really setting a lot of limits on that. Limits on screen time seem to be really different from other rules that parents and caregivers set. So caregivers seem to be much less confident in their ability to set rules about screen time. They're less sure about what to do. They have maybe the same sense as young people that if you're not online, you're missing out. When young people report everybody else is online doing this thing, it can be hard to argue with that. And it's easier to set a curfew, right? If you're out at a movie and the movie ends at 10:30, you are home by 11, right? That's clear cut. It's not always as clear cut when we talk about technology. It's not the same kind of rule setting, and parents can struggle with that for sure. So how distracting is technology for young people? And so I want to highlight just a couple of these reports. So when you ask young people whether or not they silence their devices during different activities, only about half say they silence their phone all or most of the time when sleeping. Only about a third say they do that when they're doing homework. And these are pretty high rates of teens not turning off their cell phones when going to sleep, when doing homework, even when having a meal. Only about 42% say they silence their cell phones. This is particularly problematic, I would say, for when we think about sleep, whether it's friends or the spam calls we get that have certainly increased, whether, the phone just disrupts sleep. It also makes it really easy to check your device first thing in the morning when you wake up, or you get up in the middle of the night and you see something flashing, or you see that you have a message. It's really easy to look at it. And so that's sort of a clear place where there's lots of research to suggest that cell phones and technology are really disruptive to sleep, which we know teenagers are in desperate need of and not getting enough of. So how does this look when we think about family relationships, and what does this mean for whether teens and caregivers are distracted when they're together and spending time together? About half of teens and about a third of parents say they spend too much time on their cell phones. Okay, so this is what their own reporting. So teens are recognizing this, and parents are also recognizing that they are spending too much time on their phones. 72% of teens and 57% of parents say they often or sometimes check messages as soon as they wake up, right? So we're at what I was just talking about. Having the phone in the room is disruptive to sleep, and is disruptive when you wake up. The first thing you don't want to have the first thing you do is staring at this blue light screen, trying to, adjust your eyes to the morning and get ready for the day and be trying to figure out what's on your phone. This data also asked do parents think their teens are distracted, and do teens think their parents are distracted? And about half of teens say their parents are distracted by their cell phones. And about 72% of parents say their teen is distracted, right? So think back to the numbers just above this. There's, teens are only about half of teens saying they're spending too much time, and only about a third of parents are saying they're spending too much time. But when you ask the other person, they're saying, no, they're more distracted than that. And, this is not uncommon, right? I'm not going to ask anyone to self-disclose, right? But we can all think of a time when we had to say, wait, what? Right? Like, it's a great question. Wait, what? What just happened? I'm sorry, I was distracted, right? Like, I was looking at my phone. I missed what you said. Can you repeat that? I didn't hear that. I didn't see that, because we were looking at a device and we were doing something else. And so this sets up a model for teens. So teens are seeing this behavior, and it's a hard thing when both parents and teens are doing that. How are teens learning that? How are parents learning that? And how is that sort of interrupting the family relationship? So let's Sorry. So we want to take a minute now to, Samantha's going to talk with us about COVID and what we know about that data, but also we're going to start by thinking a little bit more about your own technology use and how you would describe your teen or the teens that you work with, their technology use.
Okay, so I think I just launched this poll. So how would you describe your own social media use? So you use it frequently. Let's see, I can't see my screen with the poll and have the most up-to-date apps, or you like technology, but you try not to use it that often, or only when you have to. I'll just give you a couple minutes to think about your use and submit your answers. Okay, looks like about 80% have filled it out. So I think if I end it, you can see the results. Share results. Oh, you can. Okay. So about half are saying you like technology and social media, but you try not to use it too often. And then another 39%, you use it frequently and you have the most up-to-date apps. Let's see. So then we wanted to ask you, doing a lot, how would you describe your teens or the teens you work with, their social media use, and kind of thinking too about some of the statistics we were just kind of going through as well.
So would you say they use it frequently and they want the most up-to-date apps and devices? Would you say they like technology and social media, but they report feeling overwhelmed or stressed out by it? Or they use technology only when they have to, and they don't really have any interest in new apps or devices? We have a pretty uniform group so far.
Okay, so it's looking like, let's see, share the results. 96% they use it frequently and want the most up-to-date apps, and a few who use it but kind of feel overwhelmed or stressed out about it, which isn't too surprising based on some of the stats we just heard and what we know about teenagers as well in general. So we also did want to ask you if you wanted to put in the chat what stands out to you in both polls, or was there anything you found surprising about the percentages of usage that we talked about before? So if you want to go ahead and drop what stands out to you in the chat.
And it looks like if you have your hand up, feel free to type your question into the chat as well. We have a large number of participants and we're not able to see all of that. So I want to make sure we don't miss it. But so we use device and social media too much. Perhaps there should be another option. You use social media, but you want to reduce your usage. So even as adults, we recognize sometimes that we're using it too much and trying to make different decisions about how we do that.
Yes, and someone just mentioned hearing and seeing that teens and their parents equally distracted is a kind of a reality check.
It is difficult to reduce screen time when things have been remote, school has been remote. And my sense from talking with young people is that even those that are back in school now, a lot of their teachers and classwork is staying online. So they may be in a classroom, but they're still on devices, and then they come home and there's still a lot of work and things that they need to be doing online too.
So what new questions have emerged for you kind of around teen technology and social media use over the past kind of 18 months during the pandemic? You want to go ahead and drop those in the chat as well. Some more safe and pro-social ways for using tech. A lot about the brain too.
So technology is not going away. How do we help keep them safe? How do we help them learn to be critical consumers? Yeah.
That's a great question. How do we return to healthy boundaries around screen time as we emerge from the past 18 months, which is what we're going to talk about a little bit too later in this presentation and next too. Okay. So what has happened and is kind of still happening during COVID-19 is the kind of second part of the presentation. So during COVID, most schools moved online. So screen time naturally increased. And you can see that here with the percentages on the screen. In-home data usage went up by 18%, weekly increases in data usage for online gaming, and increases for education app downloads too. So many parents were also working from home, which is reflected in that monthly in-home data usage too, and these larger increases. So time spent on devices was perhaps kind of normalized within families. And parents may have allowed their children to use social media apps that they wouldn't have before, or as Jodi mentioned before, maybe gotten them a cell phone sooner than they expected, just to give kids, something to do and a way to stay connected to friends or family, or to even give themselves a break. Like I needed to take this meeting, and so I gave my child the iPad so that I could have an hour just away from them. So you're all home in the same home, so the usages just kind of went up. So during an August survey, we see that 63% of the responding parents reported having lowered their standards for what they deemed as appropriate levels of screen time for their children due specifically to the pandemic. And we see that too. So this graph shows the increase in time spent by children on digital devices during the pandemic. So before, we see it was about 2 to 3 hours, whereas during this survey in August, it's more about 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. So it's a lot of time, but it's not all bad time. There are lots of benefits to social media use, as we kind of mentioned, and these were true before the pandemic and true still during it. So social media gives youth a place to express themselves. It allows them to build community, connect with relatives, friends, family that maybe they couldn't have seen in person anymore. And it also prevented youth from feeling isolated and alone. And reflecting that, about half of young people say that social media has been very important to them during the pandemic, for not only staying connected to friends and family, but a third also said it was important for staying informed about current events and understanding, how to protect themselves against the virus as well. And so despite the negative content they see, digital media had been like a lifeline to them for health information, staying connected to peers, finding inspiration, and receive comfort during the difficult time. So there have really been kind of three key transitions for families: that pre-COVID use of data and social media and screen watching. Then during COVID, when things went up, they were all at home, school moved online, the increases and all across the board. And now things are opening back up. And as activities are coming back, it's kind of a new transition for families. So naturally, we'll need to reevaluate again, family social media use, and things will look different than they did before the pandemic, and that's okay. But we've heard a lot from parents, and some of you put it in the chat too, that you might be worried about how to navigate that transition or how to return to maybe pre-COVID screen time or screen rules. So some of that will happen naturally, the decreases as they return to in-person learning and their activities come back. But we've also heard a lot, as Jodi mentioned before, about teens, and that we've heard from teens that they are felt like they've spent too much time online just during this past year, and that they're beginning to intentionally seek out ways to connect with others off of social media and offline. So it's almost pushed some youth to really value that in-person interaction, but there are still things that parents can do to help. So unfortunately, there's no one size fits all when it comes to rules for screen time, the frequency and strategies, and the many devices that teens are using. The rules will depend on the youth age, their previous online behavior, their maturity, and the apps that they're using. Parents know their child the best. For some youth, they're able to log off and evaluate their own screen time, like, I've spent too much time on this, I'm not getting my work done. And for others, they might not be able to do that. And youth age is a big factor in this, and especially too where they are developmentally. So as youth get older, you might be able to pull back on some of those restrictions, but on the next slide, we'll present some general things to think about to help you set up some family rules. So some general things, be open and understanding, focusing only on the negatives of social media use will make youth less likely to come forward, not only if things go wrong, but approach the topic in a positive way with interest in what teens are doing, and respect for the knowledge of the technology, as opposed to just checking up on them. And teens aren't perfect. They make mistakes, and mistakes will likely happen online. But if you respond with care and trust, they'll be more likely to come to you when things do go wrong, or with questions about tech in the future. Ask teens why they want to use social media. Some of their reasons might include some of the things we mentioned previously, such as expressing themselves and connecting with others. And some model that behavior as well with your own use. So we saw that in the chat. Some people were kind of surprised thinking about their own technology use or their own amount of time that parents are spending and what teens are saying about parents being distracted. So establishing ground rules together, and also being clear about your monitoring goals as well, like what are your concerns and why you're concerned as well. And have your strategies to fit those goals. So don't sleep with your phone in your room, adjust blue light settings. It could be no screens before school or after 10 p.m., but set up the rules before you need them. And it's important to remain consistent in enforcing them too. There are websites that can help. We have one on the screen here. commonsensemedia.org is a great resource for parents and caregivers. There's under that need to know tab on the top, they will help you adjust privacy settings on social media. Some social media sites default to public, and you wouldn't know that. So they really break it down for you in a helpful way. And they also review movies, they review social media apps, TV shows, video games, and you can read reviews from not only parents, but from teens too, to see what teens are saying about it as well.
And I would, just to say a little bit more about that, if you have not been on their website, they have clear guidelines on what are the privacy settings and how do you set them up. That Parents Need to Know tab includes all sorts of different apps, whether it's YouTube, whether it's TikTok, whether it's Instagram. So if you're not sure what an app does that your teen wants, it's okay to say, I don't know, like, let's sit down together and look at, like, what does it do? And how can we set this up together in a way that you can then see it and understand what they're doing and understand what those settings are and what those controls are. Some of these apps now have ways for you to have a parent view so you can see what they're doing. If you set up their login, you can go in and check if you're concerned about something. And so Common Sense Media is a really good one-stop shop for getting good information about the newest tools and how to set them up and how they can be used by young people.
Right. And one of the ways that they break that down for you too, I know we've gotten a lot of questions about TikTok. TikTok is really nice in that it has a family center, and you can have a family account paired with your teens TikTok. So you set them up together and you create it. And then from your app on your phone, you are monitoring their TikTok account. So you can see the videos they're watching, you can see what they're interacting with, and you can see what they're posting from kind of your own phone without having to get your teen's phone and go through their account. And that may be a good way to kind of play through some of the settings yourself and see how these apps work too. And check out the services your cell phone provider offers. I know Google has parental controls. There are also ways on the iPhone to set not only screen limits, but certain app limits as well. You can select the social media apps you allow your child to not only download, but spend time on. So you can say only 2 hours a day on Snapchat, or an hour on Instagram and things like that, but you can allow others. So it's not just a blanket. You can really tailor that usage, which I think is nice too. And there are also pay services like Bark, which, Jodi, I don't know if you wanted to mention more about Bark or.
Well, we're getting lots of really good questions about how to do some of this monitoring and what that can look like. And I think the point, I would re-emphasize the point of being really clear about what your concerns are for your teen and being able to communicate that with them, right? So if you're reading your phone, if you're worried about who your teen is interacting with, if they're on social media and you're worried about who they're talking to, then that's a concern that you can share with them. And then your monitoring strategies may be to literally go into their phone and check and read and see who they're talking to. If you're not really concerned about that, if they're not on social media, for example, maybe you're just concerned about sleep disturbance. Maybe you're concerned that they're just spending too much time on there and not interacting with other people. And so setting limits on how long they're on the device may be more important in your family. So I think it's really important to get that clear and to be able to talk with young people about that. One of the things that I think is really helpful as we think about this transition to, I'm not going to say post-COVID, right? But post when kids were spending and adults were spending huge amounts of time online for school, for work, for learning, for after-school programs. Is to sit down with your young people and say, hey, you were online more. I was online more too, right? And now we're going back to opportunities to interact with people, to go back to other activities. Like what should we be doing differently? Like, how can we think about this differently? And young people may surprise you and have really good ideas about about that. Or like, I forgot what I used to do with my friends, or, now I'm like a year and a half older too. And so like the things I did back then aren't fun anymore. And like, what can I do now with my friends? Like, where are we allowed to go? What can we do? And so they may need some help sort of figuring some of that out. So having those conversations and being able to set those rules and be clear about them and why they're in place, I think helps young people be critical consumers of that information, but also helps them start to limit and self-monitor their own screen time of how much they're spending online. So think about, what are some of those family rules that could be in place? So the one about, that you don't sleep with phones in your room. That may be a family rule, right? So don't say to your teen, you need to put your phone in this basket at night, but I'm taking mine upstairs to go to sleep, right? So there's a lot of rules about technology and how we're using it and how we're limiting our time that are good for all of us, and is a good, I think, model and example and way to set some of those limits and help teach young people how to do that, because it's modeling that, right? So keep putting your questions in the chat. We're trying to make sure we can address as many of them as we can.
And I saw one in the chat too about self-limiting for high school age. If they do have an iPhone, you can set a setting up that tells you how much time you spent each week on social media or on your phone. And when I first turned this setting on for me, it was like, you spent 10 hours. And so I was like, oh, and I turned it off quickly during the pandemic because it just went sky high. So that can be a nice feature too, that you tell your teen about or show your teen too. And that way each week they're realizing how much time they lost on spending online.
And you can do that through some of your cell phone providers as well. If you go in and look at your data usage, for example, it will tell you, you can say to your teen, did you know that there were 1,000 text messages this month? And they might say, what? How is that possible? Okay, well, let's think about that. And maybe it's this group chat and we sort of talked through that, everybody sent only 2 messages and I really only sent 3. It's like, okay, so let's think about the context of that. So it's not easy to know how much time we're spending online and what we're doing when we are online. So that specific data will help you and will help your teen. See it. There's a couple of questions in here about sort of how it affects the brain. And I would say the one thing I would say about that is, research tells us that the brain is still developing into the 20s. And when we think about the brain developing, we need to think about it as just like every other part of the body. So we want to exercise to keep other parts of our body healthy, to grow muscles, to develop in different ways. It's the same thing with the brain. The activities that you're doing, how you're spending your time impacts how your brain is growing and learning and the different connections that are being formed. And so if you're spending 12 hours a day on video games, that will create different connections in your brain than if you're interacting with other people, or spending time reading books or listening to music or doing other sorts of activities. And so we need to think about the brain as constantly in development for young people. And it's not just happening on its own. So everything that young people are doing and how we're contributing to their development is important to impacting those connections for them. A question about smartwatches, activity trackers, use for teens. And smartwatches are generally only as smart as the phone that you have that goes with it, right? So they're not independent generally from cell phones. They don't generally do much on their own. You can certainly do some basic tracking. And I think some of that can be helpful for the young person. It depends on their I think for athletes, for someone who's running and wants to keep track of that, I think there's certainly some of that. The challenge with many smart watches is that they connect to smartphones. So when a text message comes in, it now shows up on your phone, on your watch, right? And so when an alert comes in, it now shows up on your watch. And so making sure you're clear on what those settings are on smartwatches, maybe turning some things off. So it may be that during the school day, that Bluetooth setting is off because maybe your phone's away, but those messages showing up on your watch are maybe just as problematic when you're sitting in math class. So being clear about it will be an extra step in terms of how accessible information is. A lot of that, unless it's an Apple Watch or something you can actually talk into, it's maybe more visual and not as interactive when you're seeing things just on your watch. But be careful about those constant alerts, which can be really distracting when a phone is maybe away. The watch then can take over and will be still providing those, doesn't create that break anymore from those alerts that might be coming through.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, so I just want to move through to our conclusion so that we can save time at the end too if we have any more questions. But so we know COVID-19 and distance learning have dramatically changed what screen time looks like for all of us, for youth and adults. But face-to-face interaction and communication and connecting is not going away, and it's not the same as in person. And we've seen it does still matter to teens. So as we've talked about, some of it will happen naturally and some we'll have to monitor. And hopefully some of these tips we gave you will be helpful in helping you return back to some of those other usages. Oh, Jodi, you're muted. Sorry.
Thank you. So we're going to stay on for a few more questions. I know there were a few questions in the registration about CEUs and certificates of participation. So you can go to this Z link and complete a short evaluation and request a certificate of participation that way that you can submit if you need continuing education credits for your professional work. And if you have any problems with that, please let me know. Please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions about that. So thank you for your time and energy today on a Friday afternoon here in Minnesota. So Friday afternoon as we head into the weekend. And so, oh yes, I will put that link in the chat. Thank you for that. And we will stay on for a few more minutes if you have any questions. Give me 1 second, I will get that link.
I was typing it right now.
Are you?
There we go.
Oh, did you get it? Thank you. Okay.